paying for something. All right, here we go. Yeah. That's funny. Yeah. Yeah, that's good. There we go. All right. Here we go. Chapter 35. Chapter 35. And so if you need a chapter 35, I think that there were some still on the back. So just kind of reach out and what was the old phone commercial? Reach out and touch someone? Wasn't that what it is? Yeah. Reach out and just touch a study guide or whatever. It'll be there for you. That's all there is to it. I'm going to take attendance now, so bear with me. Okay? All right. Yep. Quick attendance. Yep. There we go. That's good. Yeah, I got all your good sides. I promise. Yeah, all good sides. Yeah. I'm not going to stick my foot in my mouth this week, Bernie. No.
I'll wait for that.
Yeah, just wait for it. It's coming. It always does. Yep. The sun rises and sets. Joe puts his foot in his mouth. It's all there, right? It's all the same thing.
How big is your evening class?
How big is my evening class? Yeah, I would say somewhere between 10 to 20, depending on the night.
Okay.
Yeah.
So we got 30 here.
Yeah. Yep. Yeah, and then we have about probably somewhere between 30 and 40 that join us throughout the week online.
Yeah.
So it's good. Yeah, it's really good. It's really good. I even had some people. I still get emails about the Revelation class asking for some supplement materials that I talked about that maybe weren't available online for them. So yeah, it's good stuff.
It's great.
Yeah. No, it's a great question, Ross. It's a great question.
More commentaries have been written about the book of Revelation than all the other books.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh no, there's no question that one is the most popular book. Yeah.
Can I just tell you something before we get started?
Yeah.
The service is on Sunday.
Oh, thank you, Mary. Appreciate that. Yeah, God is good. Yeah, that was just blessed. Thank you. Appreciate that. Yeah.
You Kim did a fantastic job
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
with your children's message there.
Yeah.
The one that I saw in the first service.
No, it was great, and you know,
I felt like applauding, but I think I was being the only one.
as the Spirit moves, man, as the Spirit moves. She.
We clap off all the time.
Yeah, no, but she did. Her children's message was great. Yeah, that was phenomenal on such a tough topic to talk about with kids, right? Because you never know where kids are at when you talk about those things. So yeah, it was good. Yeah. Thanks be to God for that. That's great. Yeah, but you're right, Nate. Nothing more has been written on, more ink spilled than on Revelation. I think I shared that in the Revelation class. My senior pastor in Worthington that I served under, he absolutely, like it must have been just like a tick for him or a pet peeve or something. But like whenever somebody would say revelations, he just couldn't, like, no, it's revelation. There's just one revelation, how many different ways, but it's one revelation. And so I would often go into his office and just say, hey, I was looking through Revelations the other day. Just like it was always like Yeah, it was good. I enjoyed picking fights with him. It was fun.
If you said the book completely, the revelation of St. John.
Yeah, that's if you're gonna go all the way.
Okay.
Yeah, you gotta go all the way in it. Absolutely. But here we are back at the beginning, Genesis 35. And unfortunately, and I mean this, I wish that there was more material that has been written on Genesis, just because there's so much here. I believe it's a book that gets just overlooked, or at least assumed as to what its content actually is. But like I said, as we walk through it, there's just so much more here, and I would really like to see more scholarly work done on it. I just think that there's a lot there to chew on and digest in that. But yeah, it's good stuff. It's good stuff.
You revealed more to me than anybody prior to you.
Yeah.
And I have been through the book many, many times. But
Yeah.
you have been very enlightening.
Appreciate that, Dave. Yeah,
You really drawn stuff out of it.
yeah, appreciate
Other
that.
people have ignored
Yeah.
for one reason or the other.
Well, and that's the thing, like it's one thing to just teach a class, it's another thing that I get to actually study too, right? You know what I mean by that? Like, as you prep these things, you get to walk through and you go, oh my gosh, this is so good, they're gonna love this, right? There's just times like that where you go, this is awesome, I love this stuff. And that's what makes it a joy for me is I'm learning too. I'm looking at this sometimes with fresh eyes going, oh my goodness, I never pulled that out before, but yeah, we're gonna talk about that. Like, this is so cool. And so God's been really amazing in this. Just, hey, look at this, right? Look at this. It's been fun. It's been fun for me, so I appreciate it.
So there's an opening for you, theological study of Genesis by Pastor Joe.
Oh yeah, no, my grades at seminary never reflected that kind of
That's all.
learning. Yeah. No, my grades at seminary never reflected that. So, but it is fascinating. I really do love looking through that and pulling that out. It's great. So we talked about last week, Genesis 35. They've got to head back to Bethel. Jacob's telling them, hey, get rid of the household gods, kind of clean up a little bit. We're going to go back to where God appeared to me, where Jesus was, right? Whether or not he understands that as Jesus is another thing, but where God showed up, the angels ascended, descended, all those things. So we got to kind of clean up our act here a little bit before we head out. And we talked about that last week, you know, the household idols, the household gods, where they could have come from, could have been from the people, right? They plundered a town, so it could have been the people who were brought into them from that town. It could have been someone like Rachel who, you know, still had her family's household gods. We never actually knew what came of those outside of just that she hid them from Laban, right? Or it could have just been things that they picked up along the way. And so either way, it was just time to get rid of them. And so they buried them under that oak tree. And that concept of, you know, that tree was typically where idolatry was practiced. And so the place for idol worship became the graveyard for it, essentially. It was kind of that thought process. So then we get into the actual journeying itself. Now we're hitting the road, right? We're going on the road trip here. So it says, and as they journeyed, a terror from God fell upon the cities that were around them, so that they did not pursue the sons of Jacob. And Jacob came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is in the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him. And there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him when he fled from his brothers. And Deborah, Rebekah's nurse, died, and she was buried under an oak below Bethel. So he called its name Alan Bakuth. Okay? So Genesis 35. And if you remember back Genesis 34, one of the big things that Jacob really didn't want to provoke, what he was trying to avoid, was conflict with all the other people, right? And if you remember his rebuke to his sons, look what you did, right? You made me a stench in their nostrils, right? Now they're going to come after me, they're going to kill me. Except lo and behold, what does God do here in this verse? A great fear fell upon them all, right? And they didn't even come near him, okay? And it goes back to that concept when we talked, I think, in chapter 34. You know, trusting in God, relying on him to hand out what is needed in those instances, that justice, whatever it might be. Jacob nor his sons trusted in God to actually follow through in such an injustice. And so they took measures into their own hands. Jacob more passively, the sons more actively. And so all they really had to do was just wait on the Lord, which is essentially what God has been telling Jacob. Hey, I'm the guy, right? Like, I'm the dude who's going to help you through this. Remember who I am. And Jacob's like, yeah, that's great, but I'm still going to do what I need to do, right? And that's what we just continue to see over and over again. I read a devotion this morning from Chad Bird, who was talking about King Solomon and how there was this piece where Solomon is lifted up, you know, as this man, right? Kind of a son of man, if you will. And there's instances where throughout Scripture, these people get lifted up, and you have those moments where they get lifted up, and the next thing they do is they just fall flat on their face, right? We've seen that with Jacob over and over again. We saw that with Noah. We see that a lot in Genesis. We see that with Solomon, right? He gets lifted up, a king of wisdom, right? Godly wisdom. And he just falls flat on his face as he handles different things, right? it's very much a part of life in a sin-filled and broken world as sinful people. That's not to say like, oh, it's okay, just go with it, but it is to say, what else should we expect, right? When it comes to Jacob, when it comes to his family, when it comes to other things, that's part of it. It's falling on our face and God continuing to pick us back up and going, hey, let's keep moving, right? Because even in this, right, Jacob fell on his face hard when it came to Dinah and how she was handled, how that whole situation was taken care of. And what does God do? He says, yeah, let's go. You got to get to Bethel. Come on up. I'll take you there. We'll get you there, right? And just that piece over and over again, not just for Jacob, not just for the sons, but for us too. So Jacob didn't have anything to be afraid of. And remembering that is such an important piece, and one that Jacob often forgets over and over again as he just goes through that. Okay? So then we get the naming of this place in verses 6 through 7. They came to Luz, that is Bethel, which is the land of Canaan, he and all the people who were with him, and there he built an altar and called the place El Bethel, because there God had revealed himself to him, whom he fled from his brother. Okay? So essentially, we've got this kind of double thing here. We've got Luz, and we've got Bethel. And you got to remember where Moses is writing this from, right? He's writing down the road. So in other words, he's referring to it as probably what it's known as at that time as Luz, but Jacob is calling it Bethel. Okay? So it's not a mixture of names. It's not something going on goofy. It's just simply how Moses knew of that place at the time, what it was called, Luz, but actually what it was Bethel at Jacob's time. Okay? And really what Bethel means is God of the house of God. That El Bethel there, God of the house of God is the literal translation there. Okay. And then we get to this fascinating thing where Deborah's death is recorded. Okay? Rebecca's nurse. And it's just an oddity. And here's why it's an oddity, because we don't have Rebecca's or Leah's death recorded, right? We don't, think about it in terms of a story. The main characters, if you will, they're not mentioned in terms of their deaths, what happens to them, all those things. There's kind of a passing comment or whatever it might be, but it's not the died, buried here, all those things, right? It's just kind of glossed over, but for whatever reason, Deborah is mentioned directly here. And there's some thoughts behind that. I don't know that as I was looking through the commentaries that there's a strong thing that makes you go, yeah, that's it right there. Some people saw it as Deborah was one of the last, what would you say, like foreigners in terms of the family, if you will, right? His maidservant. She wasn't from the family, she was from an outside group, right? And so some people see her death being recorded as kind of the official end of Jacob's exile. There's just a lot of different ways to approach it, right? There wasn't really anything that made you go, yeah, that really seems to jive here. But just some different thoughts on that. Yeah, it wasn't anything really strong overall. Some people had the thought in terms of the story arc, right? In terms of, Jacob's story begins with two births, his and Esau's, right? And so here, as we kind of wrap it up, we end up with two deaths, but not really, because you have the deaths of Rachel and Isaac and Deborah, so there's really three. It just, there's not a good thing for it, but it is an oddity that this person's death is recorded and not even like Rebecca's or Leah is recorded, okay? And that Alan Bakuth, it means oak of weeping. Okay? So that's where they buried her, at the oak of weeping. Any questions about that at all? We're going to get God appearing to Jacob again, but any thoughts just as they journey here? Okay. So we're going to go into God showing up to Jacob again. It says, God appeared to Jacob again when he came from Paddan Aram and blessed him. And God said to him, your name is Jacob. No longer shall your name be called Jacob, but Israel shall be your name. So he called his name Israel. And God said to him, I am God Almighty, be fruitful and multiply. A nation and a company of nations will come before you, and kings shall come from your own body. The land that I gave to Abraham and Isaac I will give to you, and I will give the land to your offspring after you. Then God went up from him in the place where he had spoken with him. And Jacob set up a pillar in the place where he had spoken with him, a pillar of stone. He poured out a drink offering on it, poured oil on it. So Jacob called the name of the place where God had spoken with him Bethel. Okay? So this is just a lot of repetition here, right? Because if you remember back, the name change already happened, right? Jacob wrestled with God. Jacob said, hey, don't go anywhere. You need to bless me. He says, all right, I'll bless it. Now you're known as Israel, right? And so now we have this instance again where God shows up and says, hey, Jacob, your name's going to be Israel, right? So is that just like a glitch in the text, right? Is it just something that was missed? Is there something with that? Chad Bird had a good thought on this. What he called it was, and I'm going to really butcher this word. It's a made-up word, but it's Deuteronomized. Oh. Basically, Deuteronomyized discipleship. You know, essentially what you read in Deuteronomy is a lot of the same thing over and over again. And that's not necessarily because there's a different text or an issue. It's to try to help people remember, right, what is going on, what the things are that are happening. And in the same way here for Jacob, what God is doing here is saying, hey, remember, right? So I'm going to tell you the same thing, mainly because he's the God who he always says he is. He's not changing. His promises never change. So we shouldn't expect a change in that whenever he shows up to Abraham, Isaac, or Jacob. That should continue on. If he is the God who never changes, who is who he says he is, who never changes his promise, yeah, I would hope we wouldn't see a change in that, right? But it's also that name change, and you go, well, wait, how does that work? Again, it's just, hey, just remember, this is the truth, this is who you are, this is what's going on, right? And we all need those reminders. We talked about that. We fall on our face. You know, when we fall on our face, the things that God does is he picks us up as he reminds us, one, who he is, and one, who we are, right? And that's what we see even here. Jacob, this is who you are. And by the way, Jacob, this is who I am. And you just see that over and over again throughout the Old Testament, New Testament. When God picks someone up, it's always the reminders in those two places. Who he is, who they are. You could also see this as kind of a closing of Jacob's chapter. We'll talk about that as we talk about chapter 36 because it's kind of the curtain closing on the act, right? You know, if you're talking about a play, it's kind of the end of that act, right? And so we're kind of drawing down the story of Jacob where he's the main character because as we lift the curtain for the final act of Genesis, he's there, but he doesn't play a prominent role, okay? He's really not the main character. It shifts to the sons, it shifts to Joseph, it shifts in that focus, right? And so again, as we close down the act, it could just be, hey, remember at the beginning of your story, we talked about this. Now as we wind this down, let's not forget about it either, right? So kind of that piece of just reminding, but still it's that doing over to remember, to remind. Any questions about that at all? All right, so then we get to the deaths of Rachel and Isaac. Then they journeyed from Bethel. When they were still some distance from Ephrath, Rachel went into labor, and she had a hard labor. And when her labor was at its hardest, the midwife said to her, do not fear, for you have another son. And as her soul was departing, for she was dying, she called his name Ben-Oni, but his father called him Benjamin. So Rachel died, and she was buried on the way to Ephrath, that is Bethlehem. And Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. There we have that phrasing again from Moses, right? So it's still there. Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the Tower of Eder. While Israel lived in the land, Reuben went and lay with Bilhah, his father's concubine, and Israel heard of it. Just can't have a normal funeral in this family, okay? It just doesn't. Now the sons of Jacob were 12, the sons of Leah, Reuben, Jacob's firstborn, Simeon, Levi, Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, the sons of Rachel, Joseph, and Benjamin, the sons of Bilhah, Rachel's servant, Dan, and Naphtali, the sons of Zilpah, Leah's servant, Gad, and Asher. These were the sons of Jacob who were born to him in Paddan Aram. And Jacob came to his father Isaac at Mamre, or Kiriath Arba, that is Hebron, where Abraham and Isaac had sojourned. Now the days of Isaac were 180 years, and Isaac breathed his last, and he died and was gathered to his people, old and full of days, and his sons Esau and Jacob buried him. Okay? So starting with Rachel here, as we see her words, if you remember back to Genesis 30 with the Cold War having babies, right? The escalation, if you will. I'll have one, she'll have one. I'll have one, she'll. All those things back and forth. Rachel's verbiage there was, basically give me children or I'll die. And we talked about that kind of being a foreboding statement because that's what happened, right? Is that she will have children and it will cause her death. Okay, so it's a little bit of living into what her words were at the very beginning of this whole building a family situation. Okay. And then we get the name, she calls him Ben-Oni. Jacob changes it to Benjamin. And understandable, right? So Ben-Oni, son of my sorrow. Benjamin turns into son of the right hand or south. In other words, son of my power, right? That's kind of the gist. Okay. And so it's understandable why he might change that name, because every time he would hear Ben-Oni, oh, geez, all you're hearing is son of my sorrow, right? And you're back to Rachel, you're back to all of that piece. You name him Benjamin, and it comes from a place of at least strength and maybe not so much sadness tied to it. Now, what's interesting here, and I don't know that there's anything to this, but it's just an interesting note in the translation, for me at least. She called his name Ben-Oni, right? So in other words, like named him that. But then it says there, but his father called him Benjamin. So I don't know that this is an official name change per se. He may just not have called him Ben-Oni, instead just referred to him as Benjamin always, right? That could be the thing here. I don't know that there's an official name change that actually happens, but rather, for sure, at the very least, that Ben-Oni was not going to be the name going forward. Whether it was just in title, in terms of calling him a different name, or his name was literally changed by Jacob.
But Paul always referred to the fact that he was from the tribe of Benjamin,
Yeah.
not Benjamin.
Yeah, right. And that's where you could probably lean into that there is a name change, but it's just interesting wording there. And that's what I was looking at, Nate. It's just, the wording there, it's just different from called his name to called him versus saying it again. She called his name this, and then Jacob called his name that, right? Just interesting. Again, I think it's more of a name change because that's Jacob's styling. We go back to when he and Laban were naming places. Laban would call it one thing, and Jacob would go, no, that's not it. It's called this, right? That's more his styling. It fits who he is in terms of the context, but just an interesting point. Yeah. No, and that's what he gets referred to throughout. It's not a Jacob and Israel situation where there's kind of this interchanging. He is Benjamin from that time forward all the way through the rest of Scripture, right? Never again is really Ben-Oni mentioned outside of that. So. Okay. So then we get Rachel's burial place. As it's stated there, she was buried in a place that would come to be known as Ramah. And we hear that in different places. We hear it in Jeremiah referred to that. 1 Samuel speaks of it as her burial place. And then we even have Matthew 2:18 as that place, right? And what's interesting about Matthew 2:18 is that's the prophecy or the carrying out of the slaughtering of the innocents, right? And so it's kind of an interesting tie that Matthew talks about or quotes that text tying it back to Rachel, that essentially as this is happening, Rachel's voice is calling out from the grave, right? So someone who so desperately wanted children is weeping actively at the death of so many children. You know, so for a Jewish listener in Matthew, they're going, oh my goodness, there's that connection, right? So it's just an interesting connection there, but this is not just in Genesis. It gets known throughout Scripture as that's where Rachel was buried. Over and over again it gets listed.
Is Ephratah the Greek version of that word?
But you, Bethlehem Ephrathah?
Yeah.
I don't know. Yeah, I'm not sure. I'm not
Because
sure.
it's associated.
Right. Yeah, you're kind of in that Bethlehem region now,
Yeah.
right? You're kind of in that vicinity.
I mean,
Yeah, I'm not quite
it's
sure.
Luke.
Yeah. Yeah, I'm not quite sure, Nate. It's probably worth a Google. Ephrathah and Ramah. Okay. Benjamin meant son of the right hand or south. So son of my power, essentially. That's what Benjamin's name meant. Yeah, son of my power. So it goes from a position of weakness, son of my sorrow, to a position of strength, son of my power, right? Yeah. I don't know. It doesn't really say much about it, Nate. Yeah, I don't know. I don't know.
I've always associated, because that was the middle name of Bethlehem.
Yeah.
Bethlehem, Ephratah,
Yeah.
the city and county.
Right, essentially, yeah. Yeah. Right. But you knew Hope Hennepin, right? Like that's right. Oh, I really don't know. I'll have to look into that. Yeah. So then we get this name change again here, and just noting that, right? Verse 20, and Jacob set up a pillar over her tomb. It is the pillar of Rachel's tomb, which is there to this day. Then in 21, Israel journeyed on and pitched his tent beyond the tower of Eder, right? So again, just pointing out, it's kind of interchangeable here, this Jacob and Israel name. And it could be that thought, as we talked about, that sinner-saint combination there, but in this context, he's not doing anything wrong. I mean, he's just burying his wife, right? So it kind of puts a dampener on that theory, but it just kind of gets used interchangeably as we go through the story. It's not set in one way, and it's just fascinating to see that. And then we get to verse 22, where it just can't be normal. It's incest, right? I mean, that's what Reuben is doing here. He's having sexual relations with a family member. It's incest. And if you look, go to Genesis 49 real quick, verses 3 and 4. So this is Genesis 49 is Jacob blessing his sons before he dies, okay? So it's basically like the second to last chapter in the book, so we're wrapping it all up, right? And Jacob is blessing his sons, and if you look at 3 and 4, it says, Reuben, you are my firstborn, my might, and the firstfruits of my strength, preeminent in dignity and preeminent in power. Sounds good so far. Unstable as water, you shall not have preeminence, because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. He went up to my couch. Okay? So in other words, no blessing for you, because you did this thing. So when Reuben does this, he loses his blessing. Nothing there anymore.
Birthright issue.
Yeah, it's gone. It's out, right? And I'm sorry, I get a little bit of a kick out of how he says that in verse 4. You know, he's like speaking to him because you went up to your father's bed, then you defiled it. And then it's like he's speaking to other people. I mean, he literally went up to my couch, right? Like, that's the impression it gives here. It's just kind of funny. Like, you know, Reuben, you did a bad thing. He went up to my couch. Can you believe that, right? It's just the interesting way how it gets presented there. But, yeah, it's not good, right? And then if you actually continue on in verses 5 and 6, Simeon and Levi are brothers. Weapons of violence are their swords. Let my soul not come into their counsel. O my glory, be not joined to their company. For in their anger they killed men, and in their willfulness they hamstrung oxen. What is that in reference to? chapter 34, because it was Simeon and Levi who went in and slaughtered the town. And so no blessing for them either. Okay? So yeah, you're just checking them right off the list. Yep. Reuben, no. Simeon, no. Levi, nope. What else we got? That's pretty much where it's at. And so you see there that it's just Jacob is essentially going down the list and yeah, taking care of what he's supposed to take care of, which is passing on the blessing, but yeah, denies them that blessing because of their actions. Okay. And then we get the family list. Again, closing the curtain, if you will, on that chapter. All right, here we are. Just a reminder, here are the sons of Jacob, right? And here's the wives. This is how it all broke out, all of those things. So kind of more of just a closing piece to that. Okay?
I have a note that, I don't know where I got it.
Yeah.
That all these kids were born within 7 or 8 years.
It's very possible. I mean, you talk about you got 4 different wives,
Yeah.
right? You got 12 kids. It's not an uncommon thing to just, and I'm not trying to be crass about this, but just rotate, right? I mean, you're just kind of going through it. And that's, when you look at Solomon, that's what it
Yeah.
was.
Oh,
There
yeah.
was always the rotation, right?
Sure.
And again, not trying to be crass about it, but it's very possible that all these kids are very close in age. Now we're going to see in Joseph's story that he hung around, and I can't remember, we'll see it in the text itself, some of the other brothers more than others because they were closer in age. So it's at least it tells us that there's some between baby and 8-year-old, right? In terms of development, hanging out, all those things. Because carry that through, they're 16 when he's 8. Different life, right? Different life. So it's just easy to see that, yeah, there's probably some distance, but there is at least some closeness where they were identifying relationships in that closeness.
Yeah.
Yep.
I don't understand the concubine.
Yeah.
Okay, so he's got these wives.
Yep.
He's committed to, like.
Yep.
And then he's got the concubine. Then his son is with one of his concubines. Does he own them? I don't understand. My morals are not accepting.
Yeah, it shouldn't, yeah. It shouldn't, yeah. No, if you're looking at this morally, yeah, you should go, something's not right there, yeah. Yeah, your morals are spot on there. Essentially, these are gifts that were given to the wives, Leah and Rachel, on their wedding night, essentially, right? And so these two are in charge of taking care of Rachel and Leah, hygiene, all these things, right? Bathing, whatever it might be. But also in that comes the property aspect of it, right? Not slaves, but definitely not the same as Leah and Rachel, okay? And so, yeah, there is that element of ownership, yeah, and everything that might come along with that, yeah. Yeah, so no, there's, what's that?
Handmade.
Yeah, handmaiden. Yep. Yep. Yeah, it's yeah, your moral compass shouldn't be accepting that. No, it shouldn't be going, yeah, why are we doing that today, right? Like, no, it's not good. It's not good. It's not good.
And probably one of the reasons for this situation is because some women are barren and others are not, and this was to continue the line. So-
Well, there's definitely this thought of being fruitful and multiplying, right? I mean, that accompanies that. But again, it goes into, is it a God-blessed thing, or is it a man-blessed thing, meaning I'm going to take it into my own hands, right, and fulfill that piece of it, right? You know, but again, that's where it comes down to, well, God never says it's a bad thing. Yeah, God doesn't say a lot in terms of this story so far about what's bad and good and right and all those things. It doesn't mean that it's right. Just because God didn't speak directly to it doesn't mean that it's a right thing, right? But, you know, there is obviously what comes from it, which is, yeah, population, growth, multiplying, at a much faster rate than you would if you were just one wife, one husband. But, yeah. Tons of fun. Tons of fun. Yeah. And then we get the final closure here. Isaac passes, right? In the final two verses, there are three verses, 27 through 29. And just noting, right? Jacob and Esau gathered together to bury him. And that's still something that is fascinating at funerals, right? How families still, who may be in conflict or may not agree or see eye to eye on things. Again, Esau tried to reconcile. Jacob really kind of buffered against that, right? There are many families who come to funerals with that same kind of mentality toward each other, and yet they're able to gather still at the funeral and bury. Sometimes not successfully in terms of gathering, but sometimes the hatchets get buried there, and sometimes they just continue on deeper, depending on the circumstance. But something that still happens today. Yeah. So then chapter 36, we are not going to read chapter 36. If you want to, feel free to do so on your own, but these are just the Esau's descendants, okay? And there's just some question, like what is this doing here, right? You've got, I think it's like 200 names or something like that are in here. My favorite is in verse 14, Oholibama. That's a nice one. Just rolls right off the tongue, right? Oholibama. But there's just a lot here. So what does that have to do with anything? Especially because Esau's family wasn't the lineage of Christ, right? It wasn't how that came through. And basically the thought process is here again is the literary styling of just closing a chapter, right? You're just kind of sharing what happened to that character, if you will. So we're just closing that up, curtain draws on it, and you really don't hear much about it. You'll hear much about their descendants later on. You'll hear a lot about them in terms of the nations of those people, but you don't really hear about them directly so much anymore. And so again, it just feels like a closure piece. Because then when you look at chapter 37, we go right into Joseph's dreams, right? And so it just kind of wraps everything up, puts a bow on it, and calls it a day. There's a couple of things in there. It's noted that Esau's descendants were kind of at the front when it came to government or kings and things of that nature. Like they were kind of the first, or at least a big part of developing that kind of system, right? So there is something to be said about them, but for the most part, it's just a bunch of names to wrap it up, kind of the family line, if you will, and just kind of put a bow on it. So, any questions about 36 at all? See, we just 30 seconds. No. And where you get that from, just the king thing, is verse 31 and 36. These are the kings who reigned in the land of Edom before any king reigned over the Israelites. Okay? And so you have that concept of they're kind of at the front of this. They've got something going here that not a lot of people have. Okay?
Would there be anything with regard to other religions?
Oh, I mean, this is. I don't know about that, but you could definitely. I mean, these are definitely the nations of Baal, Asherah, the whole 9 yards from the Old Testament for sure. Yeah, paganism, 100%. Right. Yeah, this is. You're not going to find godly people in these descendants or in these nations that come from these descendants. You're going to find, paganism, things of that nature. Yeah, nothing prominent that we may look at today and go, yeah, that's where that came from, like Islam. Like again, with my brain just stopped. What's his name? No, back further. Abraham and Ishmael. Thank you. Yeah, they took me a lot longer, so I appreciate it, John. So nothing like that piece, but yeah, all of them come down that line. Right? Good. If you could reach in the back, John and Ruth, chapter 37 study guides are back there. If you guys wouldn't mind parting the waters with them and just kind of passing those along, we can get into Joseph's dreams. chapter 37.
You know, one of them.
All right, everybody got one okay? Good, good, good? Cool beans. Here we go, chapter 37. It says, Jacob lived in the land of his father's sojournings in the land of Canaan. These are the generations of Jacob. So again, we're drawing the curtain open now, right? You can kind of hear that in the language and how it's introducing. So we're starting the final act, okay? Joseph, being 17 years old, was pasturing the flock with his brothers. He was a boy with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, his father's wives, and Joseph brought a bad report of them to their father. Now Israel loved Joseph more than any of his sons because he was the son of his old age, and he made him a robe of many colors. But when his brothers saw that their father loved him more than all of his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him. Okay? So we have this phrase at the beginning here of verse 2. These are the generations of Jacob. And this phrasing is used about 10 times in Genesis. We've seen it in different places. I don't know that I've pointed it out as much, but this is the final of the 10. Okay, this is the last place we're going to see this. And it kind of just serves as, again, that curtain opening piece. So the first time is in Genesis 2:4, where it's these are the generations of the heavens and the earth, right? So creation. Right, we've got that piece. Genesis 5:1 is the generations of Adam. So now that creation's happened, post-fall, this is humanity, right? We're starting here. Genesis 6:9, the generations of Noah, the flood, right? So we're starting there. Genesis 10:1, the generations of the sons of Noah, what happens after the flood, okay? Genesis 11 and 10, these are the generations of Shem, right, going through, I think that's that messianic line piece. 11:27, the generations of Terah. That one is a mystery. Not quite sure why it's there, but it is, okay? So I'm not quite sure what that has to do with it. Genesis 25, verse 12, generations of Ishmael. Genesis 25:19, generations of Isaac. Genesis 36, 1 and 9, it's the generations of Esau. Genesis 37, verse 2, the generations of Jacob, right? So it kind of just serves as those, what do you want to call them, connectors. New information or connecting information, raising the curtain up to the next section, okay? But you see it 10 times, and it's just that phrasing. These are the generations of, over and over again. So this is what I was talking about, Ross, when you talked about the age thing. We see in verse 2, Joseph with the sons of Bilhah and Zilpah, they're the closest in age, right? So it makes sense that he would spend a lot of time with them. Yeah, that's who he'd be with. And then we see that Joseph is a snitch in verse 2. The sons did something and he told on them, right? I always found that to be a good way to get popular real quick when you tell on somebody, but think of it throughout the context, right? So at this point, Genesis 34 is not that far removed. I don't have a number for you, but it's not like, it's 50 years away. It's still relatively close. Even if Joseph was a newborn when that happened, that's only 17 years, right? And that's not really a long time when you consider the lifespans that are happening here. So there has to be, in my opinion, what I believe to be a lot of mistrust between Jacob and his sons, that they'll act rightfully, that they'll do the right thing. And so it would make sense to have your favorite be the one bring you the report, right? So essentially, how are my sons doing? They're doing okay, not doing so okay, It would make sense that tabs are being kept on the sons, that it wouldn't be out of the ordinary, or even just to see Joseph as just this little rat of a boy who wants to pick on his brothers, right? It kind of makes sense that this would be something happening just because of the brothers' history and Jacob's history with them in particular. And so then we get to the coat of many colors, finally. Right? We finally get there in Genesis. He had a robe of many colors. So, no, Andrew Lloyd Webber did not get that one right. It's a robe. No, I'm teasing. But this robe is not just simply a robe of favoritism in the sense of, well, I've got some really unique fabrics here. I'm going to make him something special because I love him more. What this robe is, it's a signifier saying that's the son who gets the blessing, right? That's the one who gets what should go to the firstborn. And so it's basically Jacob is saying the quiet part out loud at this point, even though there's still a long way to go before Jacob gives his blessing, as we just saw, like it's 12 chapters. There's a lot that happens between now and then, right? Basically, Jacob is calling his shot right now and says that's the one who's going to get it, which I'm sure makes all of the sons exceptionally happy, right? That they all get passed up for this guy who's going to get the blessing. Yeah. Ross, it looked like you had a question.
Where does Judah come in here?
Where does Judah come in here?
Yeah, where does he fit into this? Because
Yeah, so he would be the
that's
next in line.
What?
Judah would be the next in
Yeah.
line. So it wouldn't be Reuben, wouldn't be Simeon or Levi based on what we talked about.
Yeah.
Judah's next, right? So
Yeah.
Judah would be the one who would get it, but he's not the one to get it, right? Like at least that's what's signified here, okay? Basically,
Right.
Jacob is saying, no, Joseph is the one who's going to get it.
So what has God got in your mind here with?
We'll have to wait and find out.
Sure. Okay. All right, I'll wait. Go ahead.
But you're right. The Messianic line flows through the tribe of Judah,
I know.
right? Yeah, 100%. So how does that all play out,
Yeah.
right? It's a great question,
Okay.
right? Right?
I'll wait.
Great question.
Get the answer all the way through the Old Testament,
Yeah, that's right.
at least the historical books.
Yeah, that's pretty much it. Yep. But no, we'll get there, Ross.
All right,
We'll get there.
cool.
It's a good question, but you got to remember at one point Joseph is dead, right, to Jacob, right, and so that changes a lot of things in the family dynamic. Okay. It just does. So someone who might have received the blessing initially is no longer alive to receive that blessing from Jacob's perspective, right? So how does that transpire? How does that continue on down the line? Yep. Yep. Okay. So there we see this code is not just like a favoritism thing. It's Jacob saying out loud, that's the son who's going to get the blessing of the firstborn. He's going to be the one to receive it. That's how we're going to do this thing. Which is where you get the anger from the brothers. Okay? So it's, again, not just that he's got this special robe. It's they're getting passed by. Every single one of them for the most part. Okay. And then in verse 4, when the brothers saw that their father loved him more than all his brothers, they hated him and could not speak peacefully to him, right? It probably didn't help the situation that, again, I might be reading into it a little bit, but I'm guessing Jacob and the sons were not on good terms already, right? Just based on the experience in chapter 34. And now this is what happens. And all of a sudden you have anger on top of anger on top of anger that's being built here. At one point, like, we have this word hate in here, right? and we don't respond as much as we should to it because it's kind of common vernacular for us. Oh, I hate cheese or whatever it is, right? There's one point in the text where just in like this one verse, it said 3 times just how much the brothers hated Joseph, right? So it's not just, man, it's really inconvenient, or I just don't really like this. This is a passion, right? This is a burning hatred for what is going on. And it's not just because Joseph is being Joseph. I have to imagine, or at least believe, that some of that is because of how the dads that relationship just isn't repaired. It's not restored. And so everything that he does to Joseph just amplifies the anger even more towards Joseph. Right? Okay. So then we get Joseph had a dream. And when he told it to his brothers, they hated him even more. He said to them, "Hear this dream that I have dreamed. Behold, we were binding sheaves in the field, and behold, my sheaf arose and stood upright, and behold, your sheaves gathered around it and bowed down to my sheaf." His brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?" So they hated him even more for his dreams and for his words. Okay? So this is where I jokingly say, Joseph, read the room, right? Like, it's probably not the best idea, right?
Leave the room before you get killed.
Yeah, it's a little naive. And that's the question, Ross, right? That's the one thing that you can go two ways on Joseph here, right? You can go he's kind of this rude little dude who just wants to make this stuff known, right? Or he is just sharing what God has given him and trying to share that. And you can go two ways with this. I'm not saying that there's a right way, but what's interesting is as we continue in Joseph's line, one of the cool things that some of the scholarly work that's been done on this is that what you see in Joseph, you also see in Jesus in terms of how his life was lived and what happened to him. And we'll draw that out here as we keep walking through. And so how does that work? If this kid is just rude, can you actually compare him to Jesus then, right? If that's, do you see what I mean by that? But at the same time, when you look at these things, you go, if you know someone hates you, you also know the best move is to not make them hate you more, right? Like to go and do something that kind of pokes the bear. But yet Joseph seems to do it, and he doesn't stop. He's got another one to share with them, right? So it's not even like, okay, that was a bad idea. I'll just keep it cool for a little bit. He's like, hey, by the way, I had another one, and you're going to really love this one, right? Like, he just keeps going with it, right? So it's an interesting thing. It really is. And it's hard to say for sure where his attitude is. You can go either way with it. But the parallels that come up for Joseph and Jesus are pretty shocking. It's pretty incredible how linear their stories go, how much the same they are, just different ways, but still very similar. Okay. Now, what's important to note about this dream in particular is not just that Joseph, the brothers' sheaves bowed down to Joseph. I mean, yes, that is enough to draw the hatred. But you got to remember what's being talked about here is the labor of the brothers, right? So everything they would do, everything they would even collect, or their whole lifestyle would be bowing down to Joseph. So it's not even just the brothers themselves are bowing down. No, everything the brothers owned, everything the brothers did, everything that is about them would be bowing down to him. And that's a very, again, read the room in that context. It's probably not what you want to say, right? And again, this is what I love about the Old Testament, because you get some of the rawness in here. In verse 8, his brothers said to him, "Are you indeed to reign over us, or are you indeed to rule over us?" That word for rule and reign, same word, right? And so when you look at the Hebrew, there's no difference there. And so the best way to read that is through their anger. I mean, how many times, like, you're driving in traffic, someone cuts you off, you go, seriously? Seriously? Like, that's essentially what they're doing there. Like, you're going to rule over us? You're going to reign over us? Like, it's that building up of just how ticked off they are about this whole thing, okay? And so it's not just, again, a repetition for rep. It's to express just the heat in the room, if you will, and how hot it really is. Which then he goes, okay, I've got another one to tell you, right? Then he dreamed another dream and told it to his brothers and said, "Behold, I have dreamed another dream." Sure, they couldn't wait. "Behold, the sun, the moon, and 11 stars were bowing down to me." But when he told it to his father and to his brothers, his father rebuked him and said to him, What is this dream that you have dreamed? Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground before you? And his brothers were jealous of him, but his father kept the saying in mind. Okay? So just a quick note here. Jacob getting involved, notice the only time he does with the dreams is when it involves him, right? Especially him bowing down to Joseph. When it was the brothers, who cares, right? But all of a sudden now you're talking about me, and maybe not, right? Like, this is when I get involved as Jacob, right? Like, this is what he's thinking there. But that's the reality of it. Like, the whole family is going to come and bow down to him. And we see that carried out. That's exactly what ends up happening, right? But in the moment, they're none too pleased, right? They're not happy about that at all. And we have this comment in here, this statement from Jacob, shall, let's see here. I just want to make sure I'm getting the right wordage. Shall I and your mother and your brothers indeed come to bow ourselves to the ground? Got to remember, his mom is dead, technically, right? So this is probably a reference to Leah, who's still alive. We talked about this with Sarah. When Sarah died, right, Leah came into the picture, and she lived in the tent that was for, like, the matriarch of the family. So basically, at that moment when Leah lived in Sarah's tent, she became the matriarch, and in that way became the mother of all things. In this way here, when Rachel died, my guess is, and I think this is a very fair assumption for how Jacob operates, is that Rachel was living in that tent. Once Rachel died, Leah moved up in the world, if that makes sense. And she lived in that tent. So she became the mother of all of those things too. So it's not biological, but it is the respect, the title that is given to Leah because of her position, her status. Okay? So just drawing that out so you don't read that and go, wait a minute, I thought she died. How is that his mother? Those kinds of things. That's where that connection is. Okay? So Leah has become the matriarch, if you will, of the family in Rachel's passing. And then we get this statement. Jacob rebukes. As I said, it's interesting how he only rebukes when he's mentioned, right, in a subservient way. But then we get this statement. His father kept the saying in mind. Okay? Does that sound familiar to anything else in Scripture? But Mary pondered all these things and treasured them in her heart. In fact, when you look at the Septuagint, which is the Greek translation of the Old Testament, which was done about, it was in 200s BC, somewhere in that time frame, the wording is identical. Okay? So what Jacob is doing here is the same thing that Mary was doing in the New Testament with Jesus, particularly in Luke 2, where Jesus was in the temple. And if you remember, Mary rebuked Jesus for being in the temple. And what does Jesus say? Didn't you know I had to be in my Father's house? Okay? This is where the similarities start to come through. Okay? So as we talk about Joseph and Jesus' similarities, especially with Luke 2 in this text, both are rebuked by their parents because they're upset at them. They are surrounded by people who would eventually betray them, Joseph and his brothers. Jesus is in the temple with the teachers of the law, who would hand him over to be killed. Okay? Joseph's dreams tell of a future reality, whereas Jesus' wisdom showed a future reality, if you will. So there's that kind of connection there. Both are sold and betrayed for a few pieces of silver. For Joseph, it was 20 shekels of silver. I think for Jesus, it was 30 pieces of silver. And both would come from a pit or a tomb to save their people. So Joseph, when he was bound by his brothers, was tossed into a pit. Jesus was in the tomb. Okay? So there's some parallels that are happening here between Joseph and Jesus. And again, that's where you can read how he handles the dreams and you go, my goodness, what a little boy, right? Like, but then you see those similarities and you go, okay, what does that mean, right? What does that do now for Joseph and how he comes across? Again, I don't think you can discount or discredit, like, there's definitely some things there for how Joseph is talking about these dreams and all those things. But the similarities, the parallels between them are just too strong. They are way too strong, especially when that tie-in is there, where basically Jacob and Mary are doing the exact same thing, right? So just a fascinating thing, okay? Any questions about that at all?
I bet you're glad you're being Joseph.
I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. Yeah, I don't know. You know, you get the guy who is technically Jesus' earthly dad. Okay. But he doesn't get really talked about much, right? And then the guy who is talked about, who's Joseph, is kind of seeming as a jerk. So I don't know, right? Like, is this what I'd want? Like, I don't know. But no, it's good.
Ask his parents.
Yeah, yeah. Go ahead and ask them when I was 17 how I did. Yeah. There's probably a lot of similarities between biblical Joseph and me, right? Like, Yep. So I think that's a good place to stop. When we continue on next week, we're going to go right into basically what happens, right? Joseph is going to be sold by his brothers. There's a lot that happens between now and then, but the story continues from there. And basically, after chapter 37, Jacob really disappears, and it becomes the son's show. And we'll talk more about that disappearance next week too. But can I ask a favor of everybody? I have been working with somebody to try to get like an appointment for like months now to try to figure out some things here at church about this. Could we meet next week at like 10:15? Would that be okay? Is that okay? Like, I just need that 15 minutes just to take a couple minutes with them. But I've been working for months to get this thing done. So if we could meet at 10:15, we'll go to 11:15 if everybody's okay with that. I don't want to shorten anybody's time. If you need to go at 11, you can go at 11. I get that. But that would just help me out immensely. I'm meeting with somebody from church to connect with them too, and so it's a whole process, but it would be helpful if that's okay. So everybody okay with that? Awesome. I appreciate that. Yeah, you can still show up at 10 and have great conversation at 10:15. Settle the debate. When I come back, let's settle the debate. Is Joseph a jerk or is he a type of Christ? Like, let's just settle that debate coming back next week. But yeah, and where do I fit on that spectrum then too? Absolutely. But thank you. So online we'll start 10:15. In person here we'll start 10:15 next week. So thank you for that. I appreciate that. Let's close in prayer. Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time, and we thank you for, again, just continuing to pick us up when we fall and remind us of who you are and who we are. And just continue to do that, Lord, as we go through our day. We thank you for this last weekend. We thank you for the saints. And we pray that as we continue as those sinners and saints, that you would just guide us all the way back to you. And we pray this all in Jesus' name. Amen. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
We'll see you next week.